There are suspicions that creep in quietly, and then there are suspicions that begin to poison the air around a man until every room feels staged, every coincidence feels planted, every familiar face starts to look like part of a design he entered too late. That was where Nick had been living for days. Genoa City had seen too many disasters arrive, wrapped in bad timing to dismiss instinct as paranoia, and Nick's instincts had stopped whispering. They had become relentless. Matt was always there, never in a way obvious enough to invite immediate accusation, never in a way crude enough to turn heads on the spot, but always near the damage once the smoke began to clear. A corporate leak here, a sudden emotional collapse there, a private conflict that somehow found its way into the wrong ears, a security lapse that appeared too convenient to be random. Matt was never the center of the catastrophe. He was always the figure just off to the side, calm, useful, forgettable if one chose not to look too hard. That was exactly what began to haunt Nick. Men who truly had nothing to hide usually left behind some clutter, some inconsistency born from ordinary life. Matt left behind patterns. Nick did not arrive at suspicion through drama. He arrived through accumulation. It was the old Newman curse, learning too late that the thing destroying you rarely enters like an enemy. It enters like assistance, like harmless presence, like a man who knows when to stand close enough to be trusted and far enough to avoid scrutiny. Nick had spent enough years inside his father's world, and against his brother's instincts to know how carefully danger can dress itself. Still, even for him, this one took time. The first few times Matt appeared at the edge of a crisis, Nick dismissed it as coincidence because Genoa City attracts overlap the way storms attract lightning. Families, corporations, affairs, betrayals, all of it knotted together so tightly that the same names surface again and again whether they deserve suspicion or not. But then the overlaps became too precise. Matt showed up near the fallout of a boardroom sabotage that should have remained private. He appeared again in the orbit of a personal crisis that only a handful of people should have known was unfolding. And later, when another chain of events rattled the Newman circle, there he was again, composed, observant, almost too prepared to be useful. That was when Nick started doing what he always does when instinct hardens into conviction. He stopped talking and started watching. He watched who Matt looked at when he thought no one noticed. He watched how quickly he adapted to new information, how smoothly he folded himself into conversations that should have made him hesitant, how rarely he seemed surprised in a town where genuine surprise had become a rare luxury. Matt did not move like a man trying to belong. He moved like a man studying the rules of belonging so well that he could perform them without error. That was what finally made Nick's skin crawl. Real people fumble. Real people reveal stress in ways they do not mean to. Matt was too even, too measured, too aware of what version of himself he was offering at any given moment. At first glance, that kind of control could read as maturity. Under pressure, it read as something else. It read as rehearsal. The security footage should have been a minor detail, one more irritating loose end in a city built on hidden motives. But it was the moment everything sharpened. There had been a narrow window during one of Genoa City's most damaging recent upheavals when someone moved through a restricted area just before a crucial piece of evidence disappeared. The cameras should have captured the entire corridor. Instead, a chunk of footage was gone, surgically erased rather than corrupted. That difference mattered. Random glitches leave mess. Deliberate deletion leaves silence. When Nick reviewed the system logs, what disturbed him most was not merely that the footage had been removed, but how professionally it had been done. No frantic cover-up, no amateur digital panic. Someone had known exactly what to wipe and how to leave the rest of the system intact. It was efficient enough to look invisible unless one was already suspicious. Nick was. And once he checked the access window, the timeline brushed too close to Matt's movements to ignore. At that point, Nick's anger became personal. The Newmans had spent decades destroying each other well enough on their own. They did not need an outsider slipping through cracks, feeding off old resentments, turning existing fractures into open wounds. The thought that someone had positioned himself inside the orbit of the family with that level of patience made Nick furious in a way few things could. Because it did not just imply manipulation, it implied contempt. It implied that whoever Matt really was had looked at the Newman family and seen them as easy prey, predictable enough to infiltrate, wounded enough to exploit. Nick hated that possibility not only because it endangered the people around him, but because part of him feared it was true. The Newmans were brilliant at power and terrible at peace. They created emotional gaps big enough for strangers to build entire operations inside them. Nick had spent years trying to resist that family gravity. Now he was forced to admit the gravity had invited something monstrous to sit at their table. He said nothing at first because timing matters when the threat is embedded rather than external. In a different mood, in a different stage of life, Nick might have lunged too early, thrown accusations before proof, and let the target vanish while everyone around him argued about tone and fairness. He had made enough mistakes to know better now. So he watched longer. He retraced movements. He compared appearances. He went back through old moments that once felt incidental and suddenly looked deliberate. Each time he did, Matt's presence became harder to dismiss. The man's greatest strength had been his ordinariness. But ordinariness collapses the moment a pattern emerges. Once Nick saw the pattern, he could no longer unsee it. And once he reached that point, he could not rest until he tore the whole thing open. What made the trap more dangerous was that Matt seemed to sense the shifting atmosphere without visibly reacting to it. There are people who become defensive the moment suspicion approaches. Matt did not. If anything, the closer Nick drifted toward him, the calmer he became. That calmness was not reassuring. It was horrific. It suggested either innocence so complete it had no need to fear confrontation, or a level of self-control that bordered on predatory. Nick increasingly believed it was the second. The more he looked, the more Matt resembled someone wearing humanity the way a skilled infiltrator wears local clothing in hostile territory. Not naturally, but effectively enough to pass until the seams split. The confrontation at the Newman Ranch came after the tension had swollen past the point of containment. It was not a family gathering in the warm sense, but one of those uneasy collisions the Newmans are always doomed to create, where old architecture and polished walls become stage dressing for emotional bloodletting. The ranch had seen too many wars disguised as conversations, too many sons trying to outstare their father, too many truths detonated in rooms built to symbolize legacy. Nick chose that location deliberately. If Matt was what he suspected, forcing the confrontation inside the symbolic heart of the Newman Empire would either expose him or push him into revealing exactly how much nerve he possessed. Either result would tell Nick what he needed to know. By then, Nick's nerves had been wound so tightly that even his stillness carried threat. He no longer cared whether anyone thought he was overreacting. He no longer cared whether the family accused him of turning instinct into obsession. He had crossed into that dangerous space where certainty becomes a form of isolation. Once there, he did not intend to leave empty-handed. When he cornered Matt inside the ranch, he did so with the force of someone who had already lived too long with private dread. Every question Nick put to him was built not just from suspicion, but from insult. Who was he really? Why was he always near disaster? What had he erased? What was he waiting for? Matt listened with a composure that made the whole room feel diseased. He did not crumble. He did not lash out. He did not even seem properly offended. He answered just enough to remain plausible and not nearly enough to satisfy a man like Nick. That was the first moment the air turned poisonous for everyone present, because the calm Matt projected was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of someone who had rehearsed being doubted. Nick pressed harder because by then he could feel the shape of something dark beneath the surface, something too deliberate to be coincidence and too emotionally detached to be personal in any normal sense. Matt's face did not break. His hands remained still. His eyes tracked everything in the room with a precision that only sharpened Nick's rage. The worst part was that calmness made Nick feel almost animal by comparison. Matt's restraint reflected Nick's anger back at him, threatening to turn justified suspicion into an image of irrational aggression. That too felt strategic. Nick had seen manipulators use stillness as a weapon before. Let the other man burn hot enough, and eventually everyone mistakes heat for guilt. Nick refused to let that happen. Still, every second Matt remained composed made it harder for anyone else in the room to know which man represented danger. Then Adam arrived, and everything changed. Adam had been following his own trail, separate from Nick's, drawn by a different instinct but toward the same conclusion. If Nick's suspicion had grown from pattern and anger, Adams had grown from inconsistency and technical detail. Where Nick saw emotional timing, Adams saw operational fingerprints. The erased footage did not bother him only because it existed. It bothered him because of the sophistication behind it. Whoever deleted that segment knew enough about internal systems and external optics to leave behind confusion rather than proof. That required knowledge, preparation, and nerve. Adam had lived among corporate ghosts and psychological saboteurs long enough to recognize a professional hand when he saw one. And there was something else, something older and more intimate, stirring beneath his analysis. Matt had triggered in Adam a kind of quiet recognition he could not initially name. Not memory exactly, not familiarity in the ordinary sense. More like the discomfort of sensing a face that fit too neatly into the room, as if it had been constructed to do so. Adam did not burst into the ranch in a frenzy. He entered with the kind of controlled urgency that always made him more unsettling, because with Adam the most dangerous moments are rarely the loudest. In his hand was a small scanning device, sleek and compact, the sort of tool that looked almost unimpressive until one understood what it was built to do. He had acquired it through channels Nick neither trusted nor wanted to ask about, and that in itself was typical of Adam. He always seemed able to reach one layer beneath legality when necessity demanded it. The device was designed to detect irregularities in biometric masking, the sort of disguised facial structure that could evade casual recognition but not deeper analysis. The fact that Adam had brought it at all meant he was already entertaining a possibility more explosive than anything Nick had dared to frame aloud. Matt was not merely hiding intentions. Matt might be hiding his face. That realization landed across the room like a drop in temperature. Even before the scanner activated, a shift rippled through Matt's posture so subtle, most people would have missed it. Nick did not. Adam certainly did not. For the first time since the confrontation began, a fracture appeared. It was not panic in full. Not yet, but the first involuntary crack in a performance built on control. Matt's eyes sharpened. His breathing changed. His body reevaluated the exits. In that instant, Nick felt a brutal flash of vindication so intense it almost drowned out reason. He had been right. Not about everything, perhaps. Not yet, but right enough. The man in front of them was carrying something no ordinary lie could explain. Adam activated the scanner with a precision that felt almost surgical, and for a few stretched seconds the room seemed to hold its breath. The device cast a thin grid of analytical light across Matt's face, tracing contours invisible to the naked eye, mapping bone structure, surface tension, irregular density beneath the skin. It was cold technology in a room full of hot suspicion, and the contrast only made the scene more unnerving. The early readings flickered, then the device reacted. Not loudly, not with cinematic excess, but with enough unmistakable deviation to end all remaining doubt. Something about Matt's face was wrong, not merely altered by age or injury or chance, structured, engineered, concealed. That was the moment Matt lost control. He moved fast, faster than anyone expected from a man who had spent so long cultivating harmlessness. He lunged not like someone offended by accusation, but like someone whose survival depended on preventing the next second from happening. He turned for the nearest opening with a desperation that revealed the truth more clearly than any technology could. Innocent men protest. Trapped men run. Nick was already moving before conscious thought caught up. Years of physical tension, years of wrestling power inside the Newman family, years of anticipating attack from directions both emotional and literal had trained his body well enough. He intercepted Matt hard enough to send both of them crashing into the side of a table. The scanner slipped in Adam's hand. Furniture skidded. Glass rattled somewhere in the room. And for the first time, Matt stopped looking like a composed witness to someone else's chaos and started looking like what he truly was, a cornered operator fighting to preserve the last fragile shell of his identity. The struggle that followed was ugly precisely because it was not graceful. Men do not reveal their deepest truths elegantly. They reveal them in collisions, in stripped instinct, in the frantic physical refusal to be seen. Nick grabbed for Matt's shoulders and felt something unnatural beneath his fingers, something too taut, too layered. Adam came in from the side, blocking the path to the doorway, and for one rare, charged moment the brothers moved in the same direction, without argument, bound by nothing gentler than necessity. It did not make them allies. It made them co-conspirators in revelation. Matt fought with terrifying focus, not wild panic but precise desperation, as though he knew exactly which part of himself had to remain untouched for the lie to survive. Then the surface tore. It happened in one violent, grotesque moment that none of them would later be able to remember without feeling their stomachs tighten. Nick's grip shifted. Matt twisted. A section near the edge of the jawline gave way under strain, not like flesh yielding under pressure, but like a false layer detaching where it had been fixed too carefully. The sight was so wrong that for a heartbeat no one fully processed it. Then the tear widened. A strip of synthetic skin peeled back from the side of Matt's face, exposing a different contour beneath, harsher, older, more damaged, more real. What had seemed impossible one breath earlier became undeniable the next. Matt was wearing a face. The room dropped into a kind of horror too sharp for words. In a city built on secret paternity, false alliances, buried affairs, and legal betrayals, even the Newmans were not prepared for the violence of literal unmasking. It was not just the disguise itself that shook them. It was the intimacy of the deception. This man had stood near them, spoken with them, watched them, learned them, all while existing inside another man's skin. Nick staggered back half a step, not from fear exactly, but from the sickening sensation that his instincts had led him to a truth even he had not dared imagine in full. Adam's expression hardened into something nearly inhuman, because where Nick felt rage and vindication, Adam felt pattern. This was not random infiltration. This was design. Once exposed, the face beneath the mask altered the emotional geometry of the room completely. It was not the face of a stranger, not in the pure sense. It carried echoes of names long tied to ruin, whispers of old operations, old vendettas, perhaps even an identity once believed erased. Whether he had been surgically altered, technologically disguised, or professionally reconstructed mattered less in that moment than what his presence implied. Someone had not only sent an infiltrator into Genoa City, someone had sent a man remade for the purpose. That elevated the danger from private manipulation to organized intent. This was no opportunist freelancing at the edge of Newman chaos. This was a campaign. Nick's anger, which had been building for so long on instinct alone, finally found a target concrete enough to unleash itself against. He wanted to tear every remaining answer out of the man then and there. Wanted to know how long he had been embedded, who funded him, who he reported to, what he had already passed on, what else had been staged, which family tragedies had been nudged rather than merely observed. The fury in Nick, at that instant, was not only about being right. It was about violation. The Newmans are used to betrayal from within. Betrayal from beneath the skin itself felt different, more contaminating. He felt the insult of it with almost physical pain. Yet Adam's reaction was colder and, in some ways, far more dangerous. For him, the unmasking did not end the mystery. It deepened it. He was already thinking beyond the exposed face to the architecture behind it. If a disguised operative had been this close to them, then every recent crisis needed re-examining. Every leak, every emotional implosion, every suspicious coincidence Nick had sensed, and every technical inconsistency Adam had tracked. The question was no longer who Matt was. The question was who had built him. Adam's mind moved through possibilities with ruthless speed, and each one led somewhere darker. Corporate war disguised as personal infiltration. Old enemies resurfacing through new methods. A revenge campaign tailored specifically to exploit Newman fractures. Perhaps even someone close to Victor's old wars, returning through a proxy body and borrowed name. That possibility sent a deeper unease through Adam than he wanted to show, because for all his cynicism, for all his training in deception, even he was forced to confront how vulnerable they had been. Matt had exploited not merely access points but psychology. He had hidden inside the family's habits, inside the assumption that their most dangerous enemies always came with familiar surnames or public grudges. By presenting as a peripheral figure, he had slipped under the radar while the Newmans remained busy distrusting one another. It was brilliant in the most disgusting way. And Adam hated brilliance when it did not belong to him. The exposed man's panic only intensified once the mask was gone. There is a point at which concealment ceases to be strategy and becomes instinctive terror. He had crossed it. Whatever training had kept him still before was disintegrating under exposure. He fought again, Harder now, but not for escape alone. He fought like a man who believed being taken alive without the mask might be worse than death. That fear said more than any confession could. Nick and Adam both recognized it. There were other players behind this, powerful enough to install him, powerful enough to erase him if necessary. Powerful enough that even a man willing to live inside a false face feared them more than the Newmans in front of him. The emotional violence of the scene rippled outward through the family in complex ways. For Nick, the vindication came poisoned. He had been right to distrust Matt, right to push, right to endure everyone's silent doubt, but the truth was so much uglier than he expected that even being right brought no relief. He had uncovered an infiltrator, yes, but doing so meant admitting that the family had already been breached on a level none of them had anticipated. He felt not triumphant but furious at himself for not moving faster, not seeing sooner, not recognizing that every large Genoa City catastrophe had likely been amplified by a man quietly standing at the edge of the frame. Nick has always carried a brutal sense of responsibility when the people he loves are endangered. That instinct now curdled into guilt and anger so severe, it threatened to consume judgment. Adam, meanwhile, felt a different form of violation. He had always believed he could detect falsehood faster than most people. It was one of the few gifts pain had given him, the ability to read performance because he had spent so much of his own life weaponizing it. To realize a disguised operative had existed that close to the family, and that Nick of all people had sensed the emotional pattern before Adam conclusively proved the technical one, struck directly at his pride. That made him quieter, not louder. Quiet Adam is always when catastrophe is closest. His mind was already turning the exposure into the beginning of a hunt, and anyone who knew him well would have recognized how dangerous that was. Adam humiliated does not merely seek truth. He seeks control over the truth, over who tells it, how it spreads, and who bleeds when it lands. What makes this story burn at the core is not just the unmasking. It is the way it forces the Newman brothers into a temporary shared mission built on mutual disgust and old resentment. Nick despises that Adam was the one to bring the device that proved him right, because it means Adam gets a piece of ownership over the revelation. Adam despises that Nick's raw instinct identified the threat before everyone else, because it means Nick gets moral leverage in the aftermath. Neither man can enjoy being right because the other stands too close to the proof. This is how the Newmans destroy peace, even in the middle of shared victory. They turn confirmation into competition, truth into territory. And still, beneath that rivalry, a more frightening truth begins taking shape. Matt was never the full problem. He was evidence, a symptom of a larger architecture moving beneath Genoa City like something patient and venomous. The deleted camera segment was only the most visible sign because it was the one Nick caught. There were almost certainly others, quieter ones, older ones, embedded in logistics, emotions, routines, and trust. The unmasking at the ranch did not solve anything. It announced the scale of the infection. By the time the struggle ended and the exposed man was finally subdued, the room no longer felt like a family home. It felt like a crime scene for identity itself. The Newman Ranch, with all its history of patriarchal control and generational damage, had become the stage for something even more destabilizing than another father-son war or sibling betrayal. It had hosted the revelation that the enemy had already entered their space wearing a borrowed life. That kind of discovery does not fade. It rewrites memory. Everyone present would revisit old moments and wonder whether Matt had been watching, listening, reporting, adjusting outcomes from the edges. Even simple interactions would sour in retrospect. That is what infiltration really destroys first. Not property, not even safety. It destroys the ability to trust memory. In the days that follow, nothing will feel solid. Nick will push harder, angrier, more convinced than ever that Genoa City is rotting from its unexamined corners. Adam will become consumed with tracing the machinery behind the disguise, and that obsession will draw him toward methods the rest of the family fears for good reason. Victor, once fully aware, will not respond as a wounded father but as a war strategist seeing hostile intelligence inside his own perimeter. And the exposed man, whatever name he was born with, may prove either a key witness or a dead end depending on how far the forces behind him are willing to go to protect themselves. No version of that future is clean. But in that single violent moment, when the scanner lit up, when panic flashed across Matt's face for the first time, when his escape failed and the false skin tore loose in front of the Newmans, one truth became unavoidable. Genoa City was no longer dealing with ordinary deception. This was not an affair, not a forged document, not a boardroom setup, not even one more revenge game between the usual enemies. This was something colder and more surgical, a campaign built on the idea that the best way to break a family already at war with itself is not to attack from outside, but to enter through the spaces left open by grief, pride, and habit. Matt had done exactly that. And once a family learns it has been studied from within by a man wearing another face, the fear that follows is almost impossible to contain. Because after that, every shadow looks rehearsed, every helper looks planted, and every familiar voice starts sounding like it belongs to someone else.